welcome to another Random Code stream. I'm going to be working today on this issue that you see on the screen in GitHub. There we go. All right, so I mentioned this one yesterday. Actually, I forgot to get the media player up and running. Let's make sure it's not going to be blasting the music too bad. Okay, so I mentioned this one in the stream yesterday, and I think I'm going to give it a whirl and see if I can add it in. The times that this is actually going to come into play are very, very small. But again, it's one of those, this approach will let me do something that the other frameworks can't. And I don't know if Mocker and Substitute could or could not do this. I don't know if they would be able to detect something like this. I'm assuming they could. There's no reason why I couldn't do what I'm about to do, but, you know, it doesn't now, and I want to add this in. So I did add a couple things here, like one, there's an issue about constraints, and the thing is, if you have a constraint on a generic, and that constraint says it's a struct, it has to be a struct, then there's no reason for us to generate this code because you couldn't pass in an anonymous type, because anonymous types are, at least they are right now, classes. If you have a constraint to say it's of a particular type, then there's no reason to generate this code. If it's unmanaged, don't need to do this. So we should be looking at the constraints as well, because if we want to be a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not savvy, and not defensive either, because we could put this code in there and it'll work just fine. Well, no, it won't. I'll have to look into that more. That might put a kink into this. No, it won't, because it might. Yeah, we're going to have to do this, because if you do have a type like this, and you put a constraint on it to say it can only be struct, or it can only be unmanaged, or it can only be of a particular type, then we, on the expectation setup side, we would not be able to do this, because this type won't match it. So the constraints have to match the ability for an anonymous type to be passed in, which means it should have either no constraints or basically just say class, and that's it. Any other constraints would by definition not let you pass an anonymous type as we are defining in rocks here. So yeah. All right. Let's come into here and say manage. No, that's not what I wanted. I wanted get new branch. Let's do that. And then the one thing I wanted to change before I forgot was the name of one of the variables I did in the last fix, which is in discovery, mockable methods. Nope, not that. That. And it's this one, inaccessible. Nope, that's not what I wanted. I wanted this. Inaccessible members. This one is different. So if I ever do the feature I was thinking about, then I could do this as well. All right. So that's fine. So now let's basically get into start writing this. So the first thing we want is a type like this. And this is one that eventually will remove stuff around. Anonymous type. No, I don't. Why did you make that the first thing? Okay, so we do need the comments there as we usually do. Yeah, this type of design we use for generated by rocks is not intended for general use. So the thing I want to make sure here when I say that statement is you can use it if it's from code generated by rocks. If you just use it anywhere, that's not the intent, so don't do that. Defines a marker type as a substitute for anonymous type usage in methods with generic type parameters. The value of the anonymous type passed into a method. Good enough for now. Okay, so that's the first thing. And then this will just fall through, so that nothing needs to be done there. Now it's the generation of the code. That's the tricky part. So builders. And this doesn't matter for makes, this is just for creates. Not the expectation builder. The value and the void are both the same. And again, this is just a mess of code. I completely yeah, so it's in the value builder. We did this all in the value builder. We should do this as a separate thing. Someday I'm going to come back to this, and someday I'm going to clean this all up and make it very, very, very better. Okay. If it's yeah, so this is where the code that comes in that you see here. That's the code that gets generated there. And then we put a block around this. But this is always generated no matter what. We just have to make sure here that we cast it because the generic thing has to come around. Okay. And then that's where this comes. This one. Right here. So now, to do, need to put in the code for anonymous type handling. If it's a generic. And we're going to have to generate. So this code here, we want to say because we need to do this for every single generic parameter that comes in. Because you get, otherwise, the reason why this didn't work is because either it's just not a match, or a type is anonymous, but you gave us an anonymous type. If that doesn't work, that's fine, because this just may not be the, you might have two handlers, one where the generic type was a string and another one where it's a GUID. So this has to fall through and say, well, it's not this one, you know, but then the next one will come through and it will match on the generic is code here. So how do we want to handle this? This might be trickier than I thought. The simple case is when you have one generic parameter, but you could have two, where one is a known type, like a string, and the other one is anonymous. So how do you want to, how does the Boolean logic work in that case? I didn't think this one through too much. I think it's doable. It's just I gotta... Because this starts to get into a combinatorial explosion. You could have... You could have like 3 generic type parameters. The middle one is anonymous. The other 2 are not. So how do you then handle... yeah, I didn't think about this. How do you then handle the validation here? And you can't do a cast here like this. Yeah, I did not think that one through. There was a part of me that was going, have you really, before you dive into this, have you really thought of everything? And apparently I have not. Well, okay, so let's think of this a different way. The expectation with the handler that's defined here will say that a generic type argument is equal to anonymous type. And if that's the case, what we could just say is what you're telling us is you don't know what you think the type is. And so then we would just do an is valid passing this in. Well, what about the other parameters? It's almost like you're saying either the type that got passed in. Okay, so I gotta sketch something out here. I gotta make some notes. Let's say we have this. Void do stuff. T1, actually, everything starts with 0. T2. T0 A, T1 B, T2 C. And then later on, you do stuff where you pass in a new equals JSON and GUID, new GUID. Okay, so in this case, the first two, the first and the last, T0 and T2 are speakable types. T1 is anonymous. So the expectation type expectation should be set up like this. Expectations, methods, do stuff, arg should be set up something like this. Arg any, string, arg any, anonymous, type, arg any, GUID. So this is just saying I don't care what they are as long as that's what the types are. And let's make sure that we have this saved in our notes correctly. Because I like keeping copies of notes in the repo when I'm doing the design work or the work on the feature. Repos, JSON Bach rocks. Okay, that sounded funny. JSON Bach rocks. That was the folder sequence, so you know. Okay, so if we do this, what we're kind of saying with this if check here is we need to say our else if check should look like this. So we're going to say if type of T state is anonymous type, and that will be an extension method that I'm going to synthesize. Okay. T0 is anonymous type, and that. So what we need to say is like, sorry, I'm going to be doing a lot of parentheses here for a second. We want to say if it's this, or type of T0 equals that. Okay. So that's the first one. And I'm not saying this is the way I'm going to write the code, but I need to have this kind of separation out to get my head around this. So if it's anonymous type and this one, or T1 equals that, is this an anonymous 2? That's got to be 2. Or that. Okay. So if all that's true, now what we could do is we could say var handler is equal to well, now we need to I really doubt you can put ternaries in these parameters. That at least satisfies the check of all of them. Either you're an anonymous type and the caller said it was going to be anonymous, or the type of the type parameter is what's in the generic type handler. So if this was string and this type argument was string, you got a match. If this is defined as being an anonymous type and you said you expected an anonymous type, that's a match. Okay. So this would cover all the cases to at least determine that you're in there. Now the problem, though, is what do you do here? Because you can't do this at compile time. This is all runtime gobbledygook, for lack of a better term. So, yeah, that's tough though, because unless I made an implicit conversion, but I don't want to do that. The thing that went through my head is, if you have anonymous types in play, do all things become anonymous types? They're all passed in as object. Because otherwise, how do I know like which is valid to call? I can't just say like new data like I was planning to do here. That would work if I knew it was a anonymous type. But again, this is all runtime. I can't tell which one you expected to have happen. This is getting really messy in a hurry. And yeah, with just one, it's fine. But when you start adding more parameters into it, it becomes much harder. And what really becomes harder is this and this. You can say you found a match. You can say you incremented the call count, but you can't do any validation or callback on it. Because you just can't. Yeah, I don't know how. With multiple type parameters in play that you could do something like this without generating a whole bunch of invalid code. Yeesh. Yeesh. I thought for a second maybe I could use dynamic, but oh, I really want to avoid calling dynamic. Jeez. Like data here is of this type, and so we know we can do this. And we can't do an if and else. We can't say like if we can't say if t0 is a string, then say is valid passing in the parameter. Otherwise, pass in a new data. It won't work that way. We really have to do dynamic binding on the call sites, which sucks. That becomes a lot slower, and I really don't want to do that. And even if you handled it separately with each parameter, you still have the problem that you can't do data validation or callbacks with it. And so if it had a return value, return values can't be anonymous types. So I haven't looked at what the code looks like when that gets generated, but it like does a return is equal to return, or it does things that say, hey, if the callback has been set, use the callback, otherwise return has to be set. But if we can't call a callback, then you would have to call, you would have to set the expectation up to return a value. And those won't ever be anonymous types because you can't project that out. A caller wouldn't know what the anonymous type was. Well, that's not entirely true. Because like in link queries, which is redundant, because the queue is query, you can have an anonymous type projected out, but that's local to a that's local to something. So you can do it, I guess. The whole point of the link is that you could do that. So I guess, yeah, you could have a return. The thing is, if you're calling it, If I had something that said public T of go T stuff, and so I said new do's stuff. Let's make this execute. Execute, passing this in. Bar x equal to that. X dot. Yeah, it doesn't know what that is. If we say console write line X. Not that. Yeah, it prints that out. But we don't know what it is here. Or do we? We do. Okay, well, you can pass anonymous types out. I was always wondering why I was thinking you couldn't. Like, why was I putting myself into that kind of position in my head? Because, yeah, you definitely can. By the way, if you don't know what this is .NET Lab. This is a tool somebody wrote that you can go to lab.razor.fyi. And I found this, and I've been using this in lieu of SharpLab because SharpLab.io I really like, but for months now, it's had this weird issue that it will occasionally, depending upon if you hit a dot or you hit like a tab back or backspace or whatever, it just like will delete all of your code, and it's become just almost unusable. I find it extremely hard to use these days, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's been reported, it's a known issue, and it just never gets fixed. So I'm kind of like, maybe the person that supported it decided to say sorry, bye. So I found this, and I'm like, it seems to be scratching that itch. So yeah, you can do this. I don't know how you'd be able to set that up as an expectation. You would have to say the return type is also an anonymous type. And that you expected that to come out as an anonymous type. Maybe this is starting to become more than I can handle, or that's feasible. Because what I could do, let's just forget the return type case in a second, is if I come back to the code that I'm doing here, is I could say something like var handler is equal to type of let's just put this in an I generic create. Otherwise, so let's say we had that. Okay. So I have handler 0 ... Okay. So that's our type of. Then we'll say make generic type. I think we'd have to do something like this. If it's anonymous type, then it's type of this. Else it's going to be type of T0. I don't remember if make generic type offhand does take it like a random, like a list of things. So again, I'm going to space this out to make it a little bit easier to T1. And then T2 here. Great, we have the generic type. We don't want to create an instance of it though. Right? We don't want to do that. Well, what would you have in that case? Could do an unsafe as here and cast it to that would be ungodly ugly. Even if I could do that, that doesn't really help here because like at this point I've determined in the case I've given up here that T0 is a string, T1 is an anonymous type, and T2 is a GUID. And so what I would really love to do is something like what I'm doing up here is saying, hey, it is of this type, except the cast that I'm doing here, like I want to say generic handler is of whatever this generic type is. Hello, Windows. So like I want to cast to something, but I only want to cast to it dynamically at runtime, if that makes sense. So I can't, I know what this should be. It should basically, what I really want to do is say, I want to say something like this. Is this how do you do this? How do I even express this? Generic handler as. String. I'm just going to say a non-type here. GUID. But of course, that's this case. Another time I call it Could be totally different arguments, all different types flipped around. So I can't I can't write that in code. I have to somehow. Yeah, I'm starting to think this is impossible. The only possible way I could see doing this is with a ton of reflection code, and then dynamic would actually be something decent, but I basically heard and been told don't use the dynamic type. This would be the only case I've ever had, I think, in my entire life where dynamic could possibly help, but I feel so dirty doing it. It is ugly as sin. But here's the thought that goes through my head is, could I just say var handler is equal to dynamic of generic handler? And then I start crying because I have to start writing code like this. And then I say here, it would be A. If A is valid, type of T0 is if it's anonymous type, then we say new, and we always have to do the long forms here of A. Else, it's just A. And we do the same for the others. B, C. We found a match, do a callback. We can do the we can do this nastiness. Oh God. It's all falling apart. I just threw up in my mouth. That's horrendously bad code. But it would work. But it would work. Oh, God. And this would have to be generated for every single method that has generic parameters in play. And that's going to bloat the code base. It's going to bloat the generated code. If you're not passing in generics, it's not bad, because then we just don't do this. We don't go down this path. If it's a generic method, though, we have to. Maybe what I do is have some configuration that you could say like allow for anonymous types. So when you say on a generic, when you say you want to create the mock stuff, that you say, I know I'm going to have anonymous types passed in, so I'll take the overhead to generate this. But if you know you never don't, then that would be the default, is we just don't do this. And so that would get passed in on the attribute, and so it wouldn't affect do we make or mock or not. It would just be like, when we generate the code, do this. And it would be part of the immutable data model. So if you switched it in code, it would end up looking like a switch, and so the code would be regenerated to do it or not do it. And by default, we don't do it. You have to opt into it because it does add overhead. There's just I can't think of a way to get around this to do something different. So we don't do anything like this. We basically cast it to a dynamic. And then when we do our is valid calls here, we've got to always do this crap. There's just a ton of code that's going to get generated underneath the scenes to handle all this. So I think I'm going to stop the stream because I really, really, really need to think this through. Is this worth it? Is this really worth it to put this in? Yeah. This is a lot of code that would be generated not only in the mock, but all the gen code that dynamic would end up creating as well. Maybe I make this an opt-in feature so it only occurs when you know an anonymous type would be in play. If I decide not to do this right now, what I'll do is I'll back out everything I just did other than these notes, and then I'll commit the notes to main, just so I have them, but I won't close out the issue because this to me is so much code for so little benefit. There's one thing that I actually once said no to. I'll explain in a moment. Allow anonymous types to implement interface. There is there is a GitHub. Yes, this one. Okay. It's still a proposed. It's closed as not planned. So, okay, this is never going to happen. What's closed is a duplicate of this. Be good to support true local interface or apps are supported in Java. So this is saying anonymous interface implementation. Same syntax for anonymous is assigned as it's assigned to interface variable here, so that A is I something. You're saying that this anonymous type basically implements this interface. It's very uninteresting to me. Yeah, if we go down below here. So there's different proposals for this idea. And to me, this is really what you should be doing. Something like this. And the funny thing is yeah, let's load these. I think somewhere in here. Yeah. Okay, so I'm eating crow on this. I will eat crow. 4 years ago, I said I didn't like this. Now I do. I actually, I will state for the record that I was wrong. This was something that I think should have been actually done. Because I really would like to have the ability to say this anonymous type actually implements this interface. Because then I can say what you passed in is of that interface type, and then it would work, and I wouldn't need to do any of the stuff that I'm doing here. And like what they're saying is the way to get around this, you now have to create a type. For the sole reason to know what the type is, which of course, that's what they're saying. If you know what the type is, if you know what you want as the type, then create a type, but the scenario that I've run into this with me specifically, and the only reason I'm even considering this in Rocks is there's a case where I work in my day job where we've created some logging stuff and we want to pass in these rich objects, and it's a long story, but anonymous types is very useful there because you can make a rich hierarchy without having to declare a type, and you can just pass it in, because what we do on the other end when we actually write the log stuff is we look at the type we're given and we do use reflection. We do say, we don't know what you could give us anything. We don't know what it is. It could be an anonymous type. It could be a type that's known. But what we do is we look at like all the public instance properties that are readable and then take those values and put them in the log. So, long and short of it. The problem is that if we really want to mock what that is doing with the logger, it becomes very problematic because we can't. You can't mock stuff with anonymous types. So that's why I've been thinking about, well, could I do this? And the problem is that, well, you really can't. If you could put in your creation of the anonymous type and say, well, by the way, it implements this interface, Then, though, you have to create a whole bunch of interfaces that will say it has these properties. So it's like, well, then why wouldn't you just create the whole type anyway? And now that we have records, it's almost trivial to say, here's a record. You know? Like, if you really want to know what the type is, then just declare the type. And you're like, oh, that's, you know, that's ceremony that I don't want, but, you know, otherwise you can't discover it. You don't know what the type is. And so if you want to know what the type is, you got to. So maybe I'm talking myself out of this whole feature and saying, look, if you want to pass something in, then make it a known type. Even if something like this was ever done, you would still have to create a interface. Well, there are ways to address this. There's also $738. Yeah, that's this one. And then this is 6049. I mean, yeah, you could do that, but even if you did that, then you would say on the outside, I expect to be getting something like interface A. And so then it's really not anonymous, you know. So I'm kind of talking myself back into maybe I wasn't wrong. Especially with records now. Which I don't remember when records landed, if it landed before or after, like even 2022. Like, it's trivial to write a one-liner. Because this is also saying, for those cases where I'm passing in an anonymous type, I still have to declare an interface. I still have to declare a type to unanonymize my thing. And so if what you're expecting is something to come through, then just make a record. Make a quick record. It's not that hard. Yeah, I'm starting to convince myself that supporting anonymous types the way I'm thinking about it is wrong. You shouldn't do that. You should actually create a type. Now, that doesn't mean that having a feature like this could be useful in certain cases, you know. But apparently the C# team is not convinced about it. And for, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, because this has never landed. Apparently some other languages have features like this, so I might take a look at this later today. But I think I've talked myself out of doing this. And I'm gonna write in these notes here too. Maybe the right call is to just create a one-line record that defines the shape of what you want from an anonymous type. Because an anonymous type is just basically, I think, just read-only properties. So you would do something like this. C#. So here I would say public sealed record, name, content, string, name. And then I pass in here new name content being JSON. Even if you allowed an anonymous type to implement an interface, you still would have to declare the interface. And so if you know you want to pass an anonymous type, but you need to just make a record. It's simple, especially if that record is purely just data. It has no implementation. Do this. It's simpler. Just do this. Yeah, I'm way on the end of doing this in rocks the way I've designed it. It would be wrong. It would be a lot of work for no benefit, and that's fine. There's times that I've done this where I'm like, no, this either went down a path I don't think is correct. And when you're building things, sometimes you have to really think hard about what the consequences or what path you're going to go down if you keep going down that route. Doing something like this feels awful. It feels like, especially that every generic would have something like this created. That would be bonkers. That would just be so wrong. And then you throw in dynamic in here, and I don't even know if this code would even compile. So maybe there would be a better way to make this work, but I don't know what it is. And I think it'd just be better to say to somebody, do this. Just do this. And then pass that in here. And then you could say that my expectation, would be something like methods do stuff, arg, name, content, and you're done. And then you can do all the goodness of checking as the name JSON. You don't have to do any reflection. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Yeah. Okay. I'm good with this. Because this basically just says, make it easier on not just rocks, but yourself. If you really need to mock something and you're passing an anonymous type, by definition, it's anonymous. So there's no way for us to name it or give it a type. So you need to give a type so that we can mock it. Otherwise, we'd have to do this insanity. And yeah, it's just literally not worth. It's not worth the time to generate all that code at compile time. The performance penalty would be awful. And all you would get out in the other end is an opaque object type, and you'd have to do reflection on that to say, is there a property called name that's of type string and its value with get value is equal to this? Just bleh. It's all awful. Do this instead. Just do this. All right, so I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop the stream, and I'm going to do some lunch and other things like that. I gotta run to Lowe's because our shower head basically exploded last night. I mean, it's not that bad, but the metal thing off of the plastic tube kind of like disconnected, and then it just popped. And when I was taking a shower, so that was fun. It wasn't that big of a mess, but I was halfway through shower and I got soap all over me. I'm like, well, I got to figure out how to get this off of me. But I got to run to Lowe's and do that and replace it. And then this afternoon, I'm going to be doing a Splinter Cell stream, gaming stream. I won't be doing one tonight, though, because I forgot. Last of Us starts tonight, season 2, and I am so looking forward to that. So I'm definitely going to be watching that tonight. So I, in all likelihood, will probably not be doing a Splinter Cell stream tonight. But yeah, take a break in this, but I am all but convinced, 100% convinced that the right thing is to not do this and to recommend just create a record. It's either the compiler is going to create a type or you're going to create a type. Either way. So that I am going to stop the stream. I want to thank you for watching if you're doing it now or in the future. If you haven't subscribed to the channel just yet, please do so. I would greatly appreciate it as I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers as my first goal. So thank you in advance if you subscribe. And with that, I am done. Thank you all for watching. Take care, and I hope to see you in the future.